So it's 2025, and you've heard that you need a podcast or a YouTube channel to reach new customers and tell your brand story. But the trouble is, you may not have the time or money or technical know-how to start your own YouTube channel or host your own podcast. Enter the podcast interview guerrilla marketing strategy. This is a tried and true method to gain mind share and brand awareness and even reach and attract new customers for your company without spending hardly any money at all. Today, we're going to break down the three key elements you need to use this strategy to gain new clients for your business. Okay, so I said you only need three key elements to pull off this podcast interview strategy and achieve really good results for guerrilla marketing. And when I say really good results, I have seen this firsthand in very competitive industries, including in the fund industry, investment management, real estate, all kinds of financial services type industries where they're very, very competitive. The cost per customer acquisition is very, very high in traditional marketing channels. So I really think if you're an independent financial services company or maybe a financial advisor, or certainly if you're a fund manager, or if you're putting together your own real estate deals, this is a very, very cost-effective way to attract new clients if you execute it over time with these three elements. So let me share my screen. We're going to talk about and show these three elements. So the first thing that you need if you're going to use podcast interviews for guerrilla marketing and to gain new customers, you need to have a brand story, right? You need to have a message worth sharing, worth talking about. Because, if you think about the podcasts you listen to, you have the ones you really like that are interesting, and then there are probably some that you've listened to that aren't very interesting. And really what makes content interesting versus not interesting is a good story, right? So this is really marketing 101 is you have to know who your ideal client is and you have to know what your brand story is, what makes you unique. And this is a story that you can tell relatively quickly. If you maybe have a shorter form video, you should be able to tell at least part of your brand story. Or let's say you're in a longer form interview that is 30 minutes or 45 minutes or something. This should be something that you're able to tell also over a longer period of time. So the core brand story is usually pretty succinct, but then depending on the format, you can tell a shorter version of it or a longer version of it. And of course, story brand is really, to me, they kind of own this space of developing your brand story. So Story Brand, they have a book by Donald Miller that I think is very, very good. It, has exercises you go through to develop a very clear, good brand story. One other resource that I wanted to point out is from this HubSpot blog. And they break down the way to come up with a brand story a little bit differently. They give you instructions on how to write your brand story, but I really like this format they have where you talk about the status quo and then you talk about a conflict. And we human beings, we're hardwired for excitement and for conflict. So every good story has a conflict and then the resolution. And so if you think about like the arc of a movie or a good novel, of course, there's always conflict and then resolution. And here, though, when you're marketing your business or service or product, the resolution is generally going to be how your ideal client solves their problem or achieves some goal by using your product or service. And so HubSpot, I think they did a great job here of giving examples. So they talk about the Patagonia brand story, the Unthinkable Media brand story, the Grotto Labs brand story, the Drift brand story. They have all of these examples where they talk about the status quo that this brand story will reference, and then the conflict, as well as the resolution. And so, for instance, here, resolution Patagonia's Worn Wear program gives new life to used Patagonia products and refurbishes them to a like new state at discounted prices. So that resolution really brings in here's how Patagonia's product or service solves the conflict that was mentioned earlier in the story. So when you're thinking about how am I going to appear on podcasts and tell a compelling story and then link it back to my product, really you should think about what kind of product or service that you're selling. So for instance, let's say you manage a private real estate fund. Well, that brand story, depending on how in depth it goes, the status quo might be that a lot of investors are sick and tired of all of the volatility with traditional investments, like all the volatility of the stock market. And the conflict could be that, historically institutional investors have been able to access real estate and different kinds of alternative investments to achieve higher returns with less volatility. However, a lot of those investments haven't been available to retail investors, to everyday investors. The resolution could be, your fund is now finally giving access to this niche asset class of real estate to everyday investors. So that would just be one example of how there's a status quo, a conflict, and a resolution. And depending on the format of the the podcast or the YouTube channel you on, they may only be giving you 5 minutes of time, in which case you're going to kind of hit those highlights of the brand story. If it's a longer form interview, you're probably going to go back into like how you got into real estate or how you got interested in the backstory, the origin story of your company. All of that is part of your brand story. Once you know what your brand story is, that's step one. Let's clarify your brand story. Step two, now you need your one sheet, right? Your bio. And this is really your pitch. When you are pitching yourself as a podcast guest, you need to let the podcast host know what it is that you're prepared to talk about and what you can talk about that is actually interesting. And then you let them decide. It may not be a fit for their audience. And if it isn't, that's okay. There's plenty of podcasts out there, plenty of hosts who will be interested in your story. So this article is on Matchmaker FM, how to create a podcast guest one sheet with examples. And I think this article does a great job of explaining the key elements that you need on a one sheet. So they list five things every podcast one sheet should include. Number one, a headshot. Absolutely. You want to show your pretty face. Number two, your bio. And this is a very short version of your bio. Number three, suggested interview topics. Make it easy for the podcast host. Don't make them think about what they should ask you about so you can suggest topics. It allows them to quickly see, okay, are you as a guest going to be a fit for their show or not? Number four, suggested interview questions. Again, make it easy on the host. And you can even tee up questions that are going to allow you to tell that brand story. Number five, and it's hilarious that people forget this sometimes, your contact information. If the host does want to have you on the show, how do they contact you? This article, one thing I really liked about it is they provided some visual examples. Depending on your industry, you might have different design elements, maybe have a more, creative and fresh look, or, in finance, we have a lot of fund managers in our audience and folks in financial services. You might want something a little bit plainer, more conservative, but don't go too conservative, right? Because hosts of podcasts, they're looking for interesting people to talk to, interesting content. That's how you retain and gain listenership. So even if you're in financial services, you want to let people know you're an interesting, engaging, fun person to have on the show. Okay, so to recap, number one, you have your brand story. Number two, you've created your one sheet. And by the way, there are also services and consultants that will help with this. Number three, now you need a podcast booking service. And by the way, this is something you can do yourself, right? But typically, if you're running a company, if you're an executive or an entrepreneur, you're not going to have the time or bandwidth to go pitch yourself as a podcast guest. And additionally, sometimes it can be a little bit awkward to email people and say like, "Hey, I'd like to pitch myself to be on your podcast," and it's just a little bit more natural if someone else can pitch you as a guest. So I just went to Google and I typed in podcast booking service. 5 years ago, it seemed like there were only, a couple of these kind of agencies that were doing this. Now this is, I think, because this tactic in internet marketing has grown so much. There are tons of these services, and really you can probably find a booking service for any budget. So just browsing Google, there's literally dozens of companies that specialize in helping entrepreneurs book themselves onto podcast shows. Now, one thing I want to stress is usually one podcast interview is not going to move the needle. I mean, it might if you happen to get interviewed on some, huge podcast that has a huge audience. But where I have seen this marketing channel really work out for entrepreneurs, especially in financial services and in the investment arena, is when they commit to it and do it over time. let's say you do two podcast interviews a month. Well, it's not very much after a month or two, but after a year, now you've done 24 interviews that are appearing on audio platforms, and a lot of them will now appear on YouTube because people do video podcasts. Um, First of all, you never know which of these episodes is going to, go viral. And depending on your industry, that might not mean a million views, but it might mean 1,000 views, and it might mean out of those 1,000 views, maybe 50 or 100 ideal clients were in those. So that's actually a pretty big number, right? You never know which piece of content is going to go viral like that. So just by the law of large numbers, just by doing more of them over time consecutively, it's going to build. The other thing is, I've noticed, especially in financial services and in investment management, reputation management is so important. And so people will Google your brand name. They'll Google, if you manage a fund, they'll Google the fund manager's name. If at a financial services company, they'll Google the advisor's name. And so having all of these interviews that you've done pop up in Google when people search your name, it will make you appear more authoritative, and it will, all of that content that you recorded with other people on other people's shows, it will reinforce that brand story that you're trying to tell. And I have found, when someone listens to a podcast or watches a long form video, that's a really in-depth way to give your pitch, to pitch your product or service to someone that doesn't really feel like selling because, you've done the work to tell your brand story and make it interesting. So it's really, really effective. It doesn't require a lot of money. It does require some time and a little bit of elbow grease, but I have seen this work out for fund managers and people in financial services. And I've seen it used by everything from a one person company that's just a founder kind of on a shoestring budget. And I've also seen it used by asset managers with 1 billion in plus in AUM with their private funds. So don't get it twisted. This isn't just for really big companies with big, huge budgets. It's not for really tiny shoestring startups. It really is just for anyone who wants to use this kind of guerrilla marketing on other people's podcasts on YouTube. And they know that it's important to be on those channels, but they don't necessarily have the time or the willpower or the technical know-how. They just don't want to host their own show. So that's it. Make sure to subscribe to Fun Playbook on YouTube for more videos like these, and we'll see you soon.